Hello, everybody. Well, thank you for coming tonight. My project is called Digitizing the Past, the creation of a web-based historical atlas of Tucson, Arizona. And here's a little outline of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to go over my objectives and then talk about how I collected the data, how I collected all the maps that I'm using for this, and then how I digitize all the features for the atlas that I created, how I made the website, and then the most exciting part is the results, which are maps, and lots of maps. And then I'm going to talk about the future of this project, which is an exciting project that I'm working on with Professor John Warnock, who's actually here in the audience tonight. He's an English professor, and he's writing a book on the history of Tucson, and I'm going to help him create maps for this book, and this is the first step in that project. And then I'll go over some stuff in a conclusion. So here's a nice little map of Tucson, 1957, to give you some context. So the objective of my project was to create a detailed, comprehensive, street-level web atlas showing maps of Tucson at 6 different periods of its history. And I created a web-based atlas that shows maps of Tucson in those years, 1937, 1948, 1957, 1968, 1981, and 1995. And I picked these 6 years in particular because these were years around which available historical maps tended to cluster. I looked for maps that were detailed to a street level, that had a lot of range, that covered the basin, and that I could digitize cleanly. So the study area of my project is roughly 1,600 square miles. It covers 25 USGS 1 to 24,000 topographic maps. And for most of the digitizing I did, I used these as foundations when I could find them. I like the USGS maps because they were already georeferenced, which made it really easy to plot features on them, and because they were done to a pretty high degree of accuracy and precision most of the time. So here's a little bit about where I found my maps. You know, the USGS maps were preferred, like I said, but there were many places where there were gaps, and I also wanted to find other historic maps for greater amount of information because the USGS maps sometimes were not comprehensive, sometimes they had some outdated information. So found a lot of historic maps online, found them here at the U of A library and at the public library, the Arizona Historical Society. I bought some maps at thrift stores because I collect maps. And then there's some maps from a personal collection, which is my personal collection because I collect maps. So, you know, these are mostly topo maps, a lot of commercial road maps, and then especially back in the 30s and 40s, a lot of the maps I used were actually state highway department maps because during that period, those had the greatest precision. So first, to get this project started, I downloaded the entire Pima County GIS database, all of it, every single shapefile they have available. I stuck it all in a geodatabase, and I extracted the layers I wanted, primarily the roads layer, StreetNet All is what it's called, which was very helpful. But I took some other layers for washes, parks, Indian lands, national forests, stuff like that. So, okay, the biggest part of this project for me was road digitization. As you can imagine, covering 1,600 square miles 6 times over was quite the task. This was 8 hours a day. My eyes hurt a little bit when I was done, but I did eventually get it done. So this should say 2015, actually. So I started with the roads layer from 2015, and then I moved backwards. And going backwards in time, I modified the roads layer as appropriate for the maps from that period. And then I took that one and moved to the preceding year and so on. So over time, the task got a little bit easier because the number of roads I had to digitize got smaller and smaller and smaller. So here's a little bit of an example of what I'm talking about. This is downtown Tucson now. This is just the simple roads layer, no symbols or anything like that. This is 1957, the same area. Well, you can see how the green lines here are 2015 roads, and the 1957 map is behind it. Well, there's obviously a lot of disconnect. The area of particular interest for me is right in here, which is where they built the convention center. This is the old barrio. But there's a lot of other areas where you can tell that things have changed. So as the years went by, things had to shift a lot. And here's a little bit of this again. This shows 1957 streets overlaid on 2015, just for some visual comparison. So for each year, I tried to use the USGS topo maps as a base, but there were a lot of times when I had to reference a lot of other maps too. Some of those were scanned, some of those were nicely georeferenced, some of those were not scanned. I had to look at next to me as I was digitizing and approximate positions, which was an interesting task. When I encountered ambiguities or places where maps conflicted, I had to make some judgment calls. Sometimes I tried to use other information or context to figure out what to do, but there were some places where I just had to make some educated guesses too. So in the future, more information is welcome, and if you know of any sources of further information, I would love to hear that. So here's an example of some of this problem in road digitization. The map in question here is an Arizona State Highway map from 1937 showing downtown Tucson. The roads layer was pretty good, lined up pretty well, but you can see that there's an offset. Usually this offset is consistent, but what this map isn't showing you is that if I scrolled over 2 miles in another direction, the offset shifted the other way. So just taking the map and georeferencing it wasn't that simple. I actually had to look at it and just compare things back and forth over and over again to make judgment calls. This is another example of some of the judgment calls. These here, like for instance, this here is Hacienda del Sol Road. It goes to an old school that's now a ranch. Well, I know that the road is in this current position. There's no reason to think that it suddenly moved half a mile over. So I just chose to keep the road in its current position and assume that the old map was mistaken. This out here was an old guest ranch. This is where Ventana Canyon Resort is now, and similar thing for this road. Okay, so after I digitized all the roads, I assigned them all into classes. And there were 6 main classes, 9 different types because of some weirdness with labeling and showing roads under construction. But I put roads into freeways, numbered highways, so that's US or state highways, major roads, collector roads, local paved roads, and then dirt roads. Then after that, ran some topology checks to try to find dangles, overlapping road segments, stuff like that. And then once each year is completed, like I said, you move backwards. And here's a nice little map showing Tucson in 1961. And you'll see some of these features on one of the maps I'm about to show you in a second. This is right after they built the new freeway. So here's a little example of some of the topology work went into this. This is showing a place where I managed to digitize 2 different segments of Orange Grove on top of each other somehow, and they self-intersected, so I removed that. Now here is where this project became a little bit like SimCity with a time machine. Each map has dozens of different features on it, and the next part of doing the digitization after roads was digitizing all the features. Well, this was simple, but you can see it's pretty complex just from the number of stuff I had to do. And this isn't even a complete image. There are some more features after this as well. So here's an example of feature digitization in action. This is 1968. This is actually my neighborhood. My house is right there. And you can just see, pulling in some features here. I just put in Sam Hughes School. Here's the U of A as it existed back then. And the medical college, which was not yet a hospital. Solar energy laboratory, some cool stuff. Okay, once all this was done, I created a template for creating tiles to use as a base map for ArcGIS Online. And for each year, I use 5 zoom levels from a regional zoom, zooming in all the way to a place where you could see street layers, or I should say local streets. And standardize this template, and then I work backwards, importing the data into the feature classes each time for the template. And then I use the Maplex labeling engine to generate road labels and other labels. Uploaded it to ArcGIS Online, and then I created a website at tucsonmaps.org. Don't go to tucsonmaps.com. I discovered that that was bought by Russian hackers who were trying to install a virus in your computer. But tucsonmaps.org is great. And then I use Leaflet to write some JavaScript here to do some basic functionality, allowing you to zoom in and out, switch between maps, stuff like that. Okay, here's some examples. This is zooming in on downtown Tucson. This is the highest zoom level. Zooming in, now there's some street labels showing up. Zooming in again. Zooming in now to the point where you can see labels for various features. Schools, here's a Fox Theater, stuff like that, a mountain. And then this is the final zoom level. And whoops, on this zoom level, you can actually see also the street names for minor streets as well. Okay, well, the results of this project. This project created a web-based atlas showing Tucson in 6 different years. I thought this was a picture of Tucson. I just discovered about 15 minutes ago this is actually a picture of downtown Phoenix, which is why I came here and edited it appropriately. So I'm going to show you some examples of the functionality of this atlas in action. In the late 1960s, early 70s, the Barrio Viejo district, which is right south of Congress and Broadway, right down in here, was destroyed to build urban renewal projects, the most prominent of which is the Tucson Convention Center. About half of the barrio was destroyed. And this here is an image from the 70s showing it under construction. Well, here's 1957. You can see the old barrio right here. 1968, still there. And then suddenly 1981, boom, it's gone. And they built the convention center. And here's going forward a little bit, just in 95 to show the area just filling out a bit. I'll show you the growth of Tucson over the years. In 1937, Tucson had about 30,000 people. It was a pretty small town. In the 50s, you see the greatest expansion. It grew by 370%, which is pretty awesome. And then in the 90s, it had almost 500,000 people. This is a picture of downtown Tucson in 1933 here. So here's 1937. You can see what a tiny little core it is. This is Reed Park out here. This is Country Club. This is what is now Alvernon. Back then it was called Maple. 1948, suddenly the airport appears, but it's still pretty small. And then in the 50s, boom, it suddenly expands and grows a lot bigger. And then 1968, it's starting to fill out the basin. 1981, it's filling out more. And then by 95, it's, the basin is basically completely full. And I decided to stop my study at 95 because after that, I didn't find that the results were as interesting in terms of, because it's basically just filling out in the edges after that. Okay, here's another little example of the center part of Tucson going south, so you can see the growth of the freeway and the Air Force Base. So here's 37. You can see how small everything is. Back then, Ajo Way was called Indian School Road, like Phoenix. Reed Park had just been built. This is an interesting little subdivision out here. This was called Williams Addition, and this was knocked down in the 80s to build Williams Center. This was a nice, big style ranch houses, apparently. Okay, 1948. Aviation Parkway was well named because it went to, this has just become the Air Force Base, but before that it was the municipal airport. And Aviation Parkway was so called because you took it to go to the airport. Okay, 57, things start blowing up. The first chunk of what became Interstate 10 is going in right here. Back then it was Arizona State Route 84A. There's the downtown airport. There's now a Walmart on it. Let's see. Okay, 68, suddenly the freeway's coming in. You can see here I-10 is under construction right here. Before that, you had to get off on Benson Highway, which was US Route 80, and go down. Then 81, things look pretty familiar. Keno Parkway isn't there yet. You had to go over on Cherry Bell, cut over on Winsett. And then here's 95, and things really aren't that different now, except for they built the 210 right in there. All right, well, that's some examples of what I did, but this is also the foundation for a much larger project coming in the future. I'm working with, like I said, Professor John Warnock, who's in the back. We're going to be working on making this a foundation for a larger project that's going to go back to the foundation of Tucson, maybe even earlier than that. Right now I'm shooting to make maps going back to 1870. Here's an example of something for the future, this is a map of Tucson from 1905, and you can see just how small it is. Right here is the Speedway, which is why Speedway Boulevard was called that, because back then they used to race horses on it. I'm going to add some highway shield labels, which is, if you've ever used ArcGIS, is an enormous pain to get to work right with the labeling engine. And then larger scale zoom levels, so you'll be able to zoom in more, map some outlying areas. And the thing I'm most excited about is that you'll be able to put in photographs. And I want to be able to have users submit them too. All right, conclusion, created a web-based atlas of Tucson. It also created a lot of other featured data that can be used for other purposes, and it'll serve as a foundation for a larger historical mapping project. And here's some acknowledgments. John Warnock, of course, again. Peter Johnson, City of Tucson, helping me get the website up. And then some other people here, including Kara, who's my friend right there, who works at Epic Cafe and makes very good omelets. So yeah, so thank you. Any questions?